Massive thank you as always to patrons Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns and Justin Harper. And this week's random call out goes to patron Jennifer Cox. You can support us too at patreon.com/it's not just in your head, or follow us on social media and help spread the word. Today, psychotherapist Harriet, Fraad and substance abuse counsellor Ikoi Hero talked to Cynthia Cruz, author of The Melancholia of Class, a manifesto for the working class. Cynthia Cruz analyses how the working class are excluded, marginalised and subjected to violence, left only with the choice between assimilation into middle-class values and culture or annihilation. Cynthia examines the resultant Freudian melancholia that ensues when the working class subject leaves their origins to become someone.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Was there anything in sort of specific moments or series of events that sort of kick-started an awareness around class, or did it fade in over many years?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. Because I think, what I write about in the book, this encounter when I'm really young, I think when I was 5 or 6, right? I forget, but I think with my friend at a slumber party, and she came up to me. I remember it being in a closet, though it probably wasn't really in a closet, just some sort of darkness, and her asking me very intimately if I was ashamed of what my father did for a living. We're just children, right? And I that had never occurred to me. It was the first inflation of class consciousness, right? And so I didn't know that I was supposed to be ashamed, but then I knew, right? But then I have to say that, my experience growing up in the United States has been that nobody talks about class, that it's like symbolically doesn't even exist, and there's no language around it. So even though I had these encounters, and I had more and more of them as I found myself in these sort of middle class situations or environments, there was no language. So what I did, and I wrote about this in the book, is I just thought it was me. So when people would say similar things like that, because they never said because you're working class or because, whatever, the only place I could connect it to was myself, right? Mark Fisher writes about this a lot. So I just felt like, I sucked and everything I did was wrong. And that was and is something I carry around with me all the time that can't sort of be got out, right? But I think more recently, and I wrote about this too, I had these encounters in graduate school where it just became more pronounced. And I think because it wasn't about me anymore. So one was this experience in graduate school. We were discussing Clarice Lispector's Hour of the Star, which is an incredible book. And the teacher asked, what is this book about? And I said, it's a beautiful book about poverty. And he and my classmates all corrected me. And I remember thinking, but that's what it is, right? And then also later, another school, another program, having the teacher, a Harvard educated professor telling the class that there are no social classes in the United States. And it was just a throwaway comment. And I raised my hand. I said, well, but that's not true. My family is working class. And she then sort of disregarded my comment. And so these encounters where the very thing, right, that I'm talking about, then I experience, they're very destabilizing. But because I think they weren't just me, so both of these encounters were in relation to outside topics, I could see them better, if that makes sense. And then I started to really get angry when I realized that these affects I'd been experiencing my whole life were actually not related to me being inferior. They had to do with this class component.
I wonder, Cynthia, what effect Occupy in 2011 had, which reintroduced the concept of class through the 99% and the 1%. Did that affect you? And if so, how?
Yeah, no, it didn't. I mean, not that I was living in New York during the time, so I was aware of what was happening. And I felt an alliance with, obviously, the
Occupy
movement. So this is sort of the difficulty, right? Is I think it's two pieces. One was that, because I work so much, there was a sort of those guys are doing such great work, and I wish I had a minute to do that. I think that's a huge problem, right? So I probably was teaching 5 or 6 classes and had no insurance, this kind of thing, and felt like, if I were to do something like that, it's like an act of negative freedom, right? To actually go down there all my, during my entire days would be giving up my job, which is something that my second book is now about, is that is an important decision, right? And that's something that one can do. But at the time, it was just sort of this background. And the other thing was this discourse around 99% and 1%, I think for me, obscures the fact of sort of the middle class and the working class and the working poor and the people, all the other people. So this idea that there are the rich and then everyone else, I think was something that changed for me, right? This idea, I don't know if I thought that then either, but that it's actually my encounters, these encounters I talk about are not actually with like old money or wealthy people. It's with the middle class.
Right.
So
yes. Except the middle class is taught in the United States that they're different from the working class, although they are dependent on their labor to make money. And at least now, over 60% of Americans don't have $400 saved, no matter what the emergency there is. So that I think we're part of the deception that you capture so well is the deception that people are middle class. And once when I was at a rally, a Black minister named Evangeline Boynton said, this society has 3 classes: the haves, the have-nots, and the think they haves. And I think the middle class is taught, even if they are working class and totally dependent on the income of one or more members of the family in order to survive, that they are somehow middle class.
Exactly. No, exactly. And I think, so I guess what I was trying to articulate, and I'm not sure I was clear, was that this idea, right, which was sort of something I'd heard earlier in high school with like punk bands, right, eat the rich or kill the rich or whatever, or the rich versus everyone else, for me, obscures the fact that it's actually, for me, it's actually the middle class, right? And that I think that does something, and it's similar to what you're talking about. I mean, I grew up not necessarily thinking I was middle class, but just that there were no classes, or I think I thought there were rich and then there was everyone else, right? And that's not actually the case. That's not how I see things. So I agree with you completely. Absolutely.
I mean, I find, one of the things about reading your book, especially in my line of work, it resonated. This kind of resonates a lot in therapy spaces, because I do constantly see, people wanting to talk specifically about, their experience in what poverty did in their life. Because, I mainly worked with a lot of people who had experienced homelessness, or at the very least, like, housing insecurity for often significant amounts of time. And, it's one of those things where, like, instead of like in therapy spaces, instead of like people being able to really talk about poverty, it kind of gets shuffled into this big tent of trauma. Right. And a lot of the, and that's kind of like, I think one of the things that like really stood out to me in your book is like, there's this sense of like the middle class being, they're like, with the mention of Occupy, like, we're the 99%, they're the 1%. But like one thing that's culturally, I think, missed a lot, is the fact that like the middle class has a gatekeeper position. And they get to dictate the terms of how other people talk about and express their experience, right? Like you especially see that, in a lot of spaces. And this whole thing of kind of, it's, I mean, I grew up partially in Japan. Japan is a very class conscious society in a way. We still have, quote unquote untouchable caste that a lot of people don't really know about. And so like kind of growing up a little bit with some kind of like, I, as a little kid, I didn't think of it as a class consciousness until like, until I was like in my teens, where I was just like, oh, okay, that's what it was. But then like I moved to the South, and I think in the South is a lot more, kind of class is a lot more visible in the South, I think, than like a lot of other places. I mean, just even in terms of like language, the term classy, don't be trashy, be classy, like things like that. Like you hear it a lot more in the South than you do anywhere else, because I also lived in the Northeast and now I'm in the West Coast, right? And it seems like, the West Coast is especially where like a lot of the class is actively kind of, verbally anyway, not necessarily economically, but verbally, there's like this whole like, hey, like California, we're all hippies, we're about love, and where, things kind of really get flattened in terms of, this idea of class in California in ways that like, because one of the mentions, I mean, a lot of the artists that you mentioned in your book, are from, or a couple of them were from the South. Cat Power and the other two that you mentioned. And I do think that there is differences even within the United States in kind of how class is kind of mediated as a culture.
Yeah, no, I think what you're talking about, it's so true. And I don't know, sometimes I just get so overwhelmed. It's so true. But I think one of the things that became very clear to me was that this gatekeeper aspect, and then also language, right? So, how do we talk about these things? When you were talking about, these therapies, I mean, I've been in and out of therapy since I was in my teens, and I thought you were going to say it always goes back to the family, right? So, I had experiences with, I was in couples therapy at some point, and I was talking about this encounter. It was with this elite institution, and how I felt so traumatized, really. But it had to do with class, and it was brought right back to the personal and to my family. And it had. So I think that just the way that the middle class or the bourgeoisie is in charge of language, right? And that's a gatekeeper. So not having access to certain concepts because there's no language for them, I think for me that is directly connected to addiction. For me, addiction is a kind of repetition that is trying to find a language or trying to find a way through the circular movement. And then the other thing I was thinking about, was that being a writer, being a poet, being, trying to get a full-time job in academia, at a certain point, I realized, I had 8 books or something, and I've taught at all these institutions, and that I would never get a full-time teaching job. And it had nothing to do with my ability. I mean, my students love me. I have students, who, after many years, contact me and tell me, how, helpful I was, and just realizing that it had to do with something beyond my, for many years, beyond my comprehension, right? So this thing, right? And so like when I went to Mills College, this private elite women's, liberal women's college, I felt so alienated, but I had no language to talk about it, so, I don't know. Talking about this is so great, right?
Yeah, I think the other thing is just this idea of gatekeeping, I think is sort of fundamental to probably all of it, because I don't think sometimes people realize that they are in a gatekeeper position, and it's controlling taste. It controls, like you said, language, but also like slang to some degree. Like there's that whole code switching. Is that the right term?
Yeah.
Where it's like you have to alter your language to appear sort of in some way like respectable or professional or something. You're not allowed to speak like you might at home or from where you're from. And like you say, that, and I think why this is important, and like correctly, like you say, why it's about language, is because a huge part of this is this stuff that's just sort of floating in the air, that until you can sort of actually pin it down with language, you don't necessarily see it. You definitely feel it. And you do suddenly realize it's everywhere. And certainly, for me, this book definitely made me reflect a lot on, my life, and I'm sure it would lots of other people reading it. But yeah, if it's not to sort of take a left turn, like one of the sort of questions I had sort of around culture, again, this sort of amorphous thing that is in the air. Like we have spoken about this in the past in the podcast with, the ideology of neoliberalism to some degree pushes you to be your perfect self, like the best version of you, right? And that you talk, it's towards the end of the book, so maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but you talk about splitting. And I don't think I'd really sort of come across this, or particularly the way that you'd framed it. You talked about splitting, you gave some examples of famous artists who ultimately sort of did it. And I just wondered if you could talk about what sort of splitting is, sort of your interpretation of it and the consequences of it, and maybe what role it's played in your life as well.
So this idea, I think with cat power, this night that she describes, right? It's so intense, this night where she's in this home she's sharing with this other musician who's away, and her past, literally, she describes it like ghosts coming up against her window. And she has this decision, which is to either turn to the past or basically forsake all of that and become something else. And I think that, but you think usually we are in this sort of internal divide, right? So that's a very clear sort of cut. And I think most of the time there's just this kind of shift. And it was one of the things I've been thinking about is a kind of madness that I was seeing around people that I know who had assimilated to a certain extent, but then, you could never fully assimilate, as far as I can tell, working class or working poor, because you're always never going to be consumable or digestible by the system. So it's a very violent thing that you're putting yourself through and the system's putting yourself through, but you're aware of the fact that there is this split. And this is actually what Hegel determines, not in this context, but he defines derangement or madness as this internal split. So, so that's sort of what another of my projects is about. But I think when I realized this, then there was a huge sense of freedom. And I love Genet, for example, or some of the people that I wrote about, Liz Spector, because they came up against this sort of possibility of assimilation or conformism, selling who they are, I guess, to a certain extent, and then decided not to, right? And I think that's a huge freedom to not have to do that, right? And one of the films I think I briefly talk about, Alexander Kluge's Abschied von Gestern, is such a delightful film. I just watched it again yesterday with my students, because she's this main character is exactly that thing. She just, in a way, doesn't care, so she steals things or she does all these things, and she's not concerned about what she looks like, and I think this thing about how we look and assimilation, it just gets worse and worse with social media and all this other stuff right now. Basically, to be an artist or a public figure in any sense, you have to sell your persona as a part of that. And I just find it to be extremely obscene and gruesome, that aspect,
Yeah, it was definitely, it's interesting to hear you say all of that, because one of the, one of the key points of this book is obviously that there's a sort of a loss, or there's a haunting that happens. Mm-hmm. And in one of the examples, I think was it like Bruce Springsteen or Alice Cooper or one of those people just seeing someone on TV when they were a kid, and just realizing like, oh, if I put on a face, if I put on a performance, that can be my way out of this kind of not particularly happy life I might have ahead of me. And that idea that performance, that persona you put on may allow you to escape and like acquire more money or capital or whatever, and potentially have a better quality of life, more free time, all that kind of stuff. But exactly in that moment where you decide to be someone else, or I want to be better, or I want to be this other thing, that's the moment you sort of begin the haunting to some degree, right? Because that's the moment you've taken you realize that you can't be who you are if you want to get out of the situation you're in. And in succeeding, in winning, you sort of lose something as well. And that seemed to be sort of a real driving force. Particularly, I got the impression from your story, from your experiences, and just the general atmosphere of the book is this sense of sort of loss. And how do you go back to this thing that you were told to not value?
Right. And the thing about it, right, is that there is no going back. I mean, right. And I think actually twice in the book, or there's two examples. One is the Bruce Springsteen, where he's talking about, this is in the book, sitting with his mother watching television. And I think, right, gosh, I forgot who we saw, but this decision. And but Mark Linkous saw Alice Cooper and also saw on TV and made this decision. And so it's right. You're right. As soon as that decision's made, it's sort of something's already being lost, right? And that loss can never be, right? You can never get it back. But also, if there's no language for what's happening, it can never be mourned, right? Which is this whole melancholia thing. And this is the divide, right? So you realize, well, look, I've given up everything, but I don't want to do this anymore. And then you're in this sort of liminal space, right?
Yeah, and like you said, Bruce Springsteen had a couple of meltdowns as a result of all of this stuff, because you do, if you are the sort of the lucky ones who quote unquote succeed, that there's still that thing you have to deal with, that thing that catches up with you. Like you said, this sort of, you're kind of stuck between two places. Are you Bruce Springsteen, the sort of performer, or are you Bruce Springsteen from from the past? And I think the cost of assimilation is sort of another fascinating aspect of all of this, of the book and of your story. And it's interesting as well hearing about your sort of academic experiences, that like, even though you have the knowledge and you have assimilated, and I'm sure you can sort of navigate that whole academic world, that then to sort of not necessarily be rewarded, to not belong there. Yeah. It's like a crap prize, isn't it? for doing the work, Yeah,
the thing, I would actually say that I'm not. I mean, what I'm good at is, I think, hopefully teaching and thinking and getting these thoughts on paper. Let's hope that's what I'm good at, because that's what I'm trying to do. What I'm less good at is all the other business, and more academia and the literary world are this other kind of business, and things like that. And I pretty much fail at that stuff. And I think one of the things that I came around to was realizing that failure was actually what saved me, right? And I think that-that's hopefully, part of the book, is this realization that if you fail, then thank God, right? Because then you're still in this middle space in a way, right? Because without this little space, I can't see it. Without distance, I can't see it. And so, that's good,
There were periods in the United States where that consciousness of class and of the nobility of the working class, the contributions of the working class around folk music, around the Communist Party, which in the 30s was huge, around the union movement when it was a left movement. There was this honoring of the people who build everything that we see around us. All the buildings, all the streets, the people's labor that went into building this society. And then in the McCarthy era in the 50s, that was crushed, and they advanced this idea of a middle class, even though really now, even though the majority of women are single, only 3% of women earn what is called a middle class salary, $150,000 a year, to afford a middle class, what they define as a middle class life. There is this idea of aspiring to a middle class rather than being proud of your labor, whatever it is, and its contribution to the society. And it also relaxed a little bit in the beginning of the women's liberation movement in the 1960s, when it was leftists who began that movement. And I do remember, because I think it's really relevant here to the language, being on a panel, because it was an initial women's liberation panel in New Haven, Connecticut, because I lived in New Haven at that time. And we were debating me and Naomi Weinstein, a scientist who made models of the brain and a brilliant woman. We were debating these Yale anthropologists who said that women's destiny is to serve chosen men, just like this chimpanzee and the ape and so on. And after they finished their pompous erudition, Naomi Weinstein, who spoke next, said, "Oh, for heaven's sakes, you have your monkeys. We have our monkeys. Who's going to pull out their monkeys? It's ridiculous." And everybody laughed because it punctured a hole in that puffed up, pretentious discourse of those talking head white males at Yale. And there was that voice, and it still is there in the works of Joe Bagent, in his novels, one of which was a bestseller, that Deer Hunting with Jesus, that book of his. And also in some of the rock and roll songs, and in some novels like Bastard Out of Carolina, which is a very powerful story. But that it's there. It's like an undercurrent underneath that every once in a while spikes up. And I think it will be there, and your book will be very important as a left reemerges in the United States without the pretense that we're all one happy middle-class family, as people are continuously dispossessed in the United States. Those discoveries that you're writing about will be more celebrated and more present in the whole discourse. Class is now much more part of the discourse than it was before, as Americans have become more immiserated.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought that up. I had sort of put my finger on the mid 70s. And in the book, I talk a little bit about the labor movement and the Democratic Party, and how I think for a lot of working class in the United States, because of the different forms of abandonment that happened, they just turned away. I don't think that's the case for everyone, but I know for my father, for example, and other people, there was just a sense of, the Democratic Party was, and then this whole thing happened. So it's so great to hear you talk about these other points, which I don't talk about in the book.
Yeah, and I think the tide turned with Bill Clinton, because the old alliance between Labor, which got him elected initially, with the Democratic Party getting their money and energy from labor and people who are workers, which put Clinton in office in the first place, and then he signed NAFTA to take away people's jobs and switched over to two corporate parties, and the Democratic Party being a second capitalist corporate party, and the working class turned away because no one represented them, and because all that money made from outsourcing came back and bought the political process, which is for sale. And that was a disaster, which is only now beginning to assert itself, only now.
It's interesting because you give a couple of examples of a couple of different films and stuff, and certainly, again, education for me, that this idea that apathy is defensiveness, that it's useful to survival to be passive. Was it Wonder? Was that the Wonder was the key film I think you were talking about?
Yeah, that was one of the, I think I talked about 2 films.
Yeah.
But yeah, one there.
Yeah, and also you sort of talk about the death drive in various different places. I don't know if this 100% relates to everything we've just been talking about, but I don't know if there's any examples that are on the tip of your tongue around all of this stuff. Because as far as I understand it, the death drive it wants to sort of burn everything down to the ground to start again, right?
So Jason Molina, right, drank himself to death, and then there's drugs, with Amy Winehouse and Mark Linkous, and so I don't know. One of the things I was thinking about, and this is what got me thinking about this book I'm working on now on the working class and the death drive and negative freedom, but it's really just about negative freedom. Is this the way I think, especially when you look at both Mark Link, all of them, right? It's not a desire to kill themselves, right? It's not, and this is one of the things that I wanted to have a kind of intervention with, is this, which is why the second book, this idea of, if you don't have anything, if you're poor, if you're suffering, why on earth would you, use heroin or drink or, spend all your money, this kind of thing. And of course, it's not like that, right? One of the things is that you need to find another world to exist in, because this world, capitalism is everywhere. There's no escape. So the only world is to go inside yourself, but inside another world, because inside yourself is just more of the same. I mean, it's all the same, but this is sort of one of the things, right? So eating disorder or drinking, all of this stuff provides this thing, but then also it's circuitous, right? And because it's a form of compulsive repetition, there's sort of an incremental move forward, and it's always a move backwards, right? And of course, one isn't thinking of that, or maybe one is, but presumably one isn't. It isn't like that, right? But that it's not necessarily a desire to kill yourself, right? It's something entirely different. And I think it's connected to what I was saying earlier about, and Liam, you mentioned earlier, this like feeling, right? This, because I always had a visceral feeling about what this was, but I never had the language. And so I think, again, that these are different forms of, again, unconscious, right? It's not conscious, trying to get sort of a foothold on a kind of language or a means to escape this circle. It doesn't make logical sense, but then capitalism doesn't make logical sense. It's insane. I don't know if that made any sense. But
yeah, well, it's a key point. And again, I definitely felt. It was just really interesting, your whole perspective on eating disorders as an act of autonomy or resistance. Exactly, because you said it perfectly. It's like we exist in this world for huge numbers of people. It's not particularly great, so you have to find a way to survive, and so you find a way, right? Like you find a way to refuse and sort of resist the things that you don't like in this world. And maybe the healthiest version of it is collective political power, and you all get together and you try and change things, but you have to be in a certain sort of mindset, maybe in a certain sort of level of health to do that. And if everyone's isolated, it makes sense that people sort of turn inwards. And I thought your observations about eating disorders as a way of sort of being illustrative of like power of the individual is sort of fascinating.
Yeah, it was interesting because I've been told, I can't tell you how many times, that I was wrong about this idea that I had that so in the United States, the idea of an eating disorder is always young, white, middle class, or elite women or girls. Like that is it. So when I would talk to people about the possibility, I mean, my own experience, but also the possibility of this not being the only, case. And in fact, the number of young women and older women and all kinds of age of women and men too, who have this experience, but then either don't have health insurance, so, wouldn't be diagnosed, or not diagnosed or misdiagnosed because really it is considered a middle class illness. Anyway, that's all to say that when the book got out there, I received a number of responses from men of different. I mean, I think there were a couple women, but a lot of men who contacted me and said they'd grown up working class or working poor, and had struggled their entire lives with an eating disorder. And just to be clear, anorexia, bulimia, this type. So, yeah. So, again, it doesn't make any sense, but none of this makes sense, But I've been thinking for a long time about how anorexia and bulimia are, I think, symbolically, they're pretty clear ways of resisting, and also they're sort of static. So they're forms of sort of staying in place as if a holding pattern. So something else might happen. And I think, what you all were saying just a moment ago, that that there is no language and that we're all isolated. Then there is no other choice. But I think, again, by talking about this, putting language to it, hopefully this doesn't have to be the case anymore. And really, that was one of the main reasons for writing the book. Like I said in the beginning, was this idea that at least, maybe some people would come across the book and realize that their struggles, that the difficulties they'd had were related to class, and this class consciousness, which is not the final step, obviously, might be a beginning, right? Might be a beginning.
Well, I think it's particularly important because you use Freud and therapeutic concepts, because our field is particularly backward in identifying the forces that are not just in our heads, but are in the social and political and economic environment in which we live. And so that the reintroduction of that is very important. Freud wasn't so great on that either, but it ties people into the political, social, and economic forces that contribute to their problems and malaise, which is very important in our field, particularly where people are naive, liberal, and often disinterested in those other forces.
Right.
Yeah, and I think there's a key line, for me, was you wrote, "What they want does not exist," and I think that's the rub of everything. And to my mind, reading this, like the political project is to give people more free time. Like ultimately, that I see as being some sort of part of the magic fun end game of any sort of political movement, is to free up people to have the space and time to just do the things they want, opposed to being under the control of a boss or a landlord or any of that stuff. But that maybe doesn't happen until there's some sort of recognition that these things that everyone is experiencing, they're not sort of unique. They're not unique to you. They are sort of
not personal.
They're symptoms of the system, kind of thing.
Yeah, and just to say, specifically about the anorexia, or the idea of anorexia, this let me think about it for a second. This idea of, right, so refusing or resisting, digesting the culture. I mean, it's such an obvious metaphor, right? Not taking in, or bulimia, taking it in, but then getting rid of it. So these both seem to me to be forms of saying, I don't want this, but then they're also not providing something else, right? And so for me, that's because there is nothing else, right? And specifically about capitalism, I mean, all we have, I mean, not in concept, right? But all we have around us, everything is this other thing. So that's why I see it as a kind of, all of these, I think, addictions and forms of compulsive repetition are sort of forms of holding patterns, right? And again, it's unconscious, but this, like, I don't want this, but what I want doesn't exist yet. And that's why, it's important for, people to become class conscious, working class or working poor, and realize like it's not you, you're not mad. And that there is something else, but that we have to, get together and figure this out together.
That's where socialist consciousness and class consciousness and political consciousness, which has been so absent from America, is really present. Like, it's one of the things that has totally captured me lately, is realizing that between a half and 2/3 of the original settlers were bondspeople, or people whose way was paid over here as an alternative to prison or the poorhouse, and they belonged to someone else, and their labor was sold at a marketplace when they arrived, and they had to work for between 4 and usually 4 and 7 years old, 7 years, and if they ran away and were captured, they could be whipped and beaten, and they had to serve more. And so their labor was owned, even though their person wasn't like slaves. But that's who our ancestors were, and it's hidden from us in the history books. If we all learned it, it would help. That our labor was sold, and we were not here just because we were making a wonderful religious choice, but because we had no alternative but prison, or were kidnapped, or the kids were picked up off the street when they were poor and begging, and shipped here to have our labor sold. It's a very different idea of who we are as a people. And it's part of that capitalist distortion of our own history, both personal and also national.
And how you come to learn that stuff, I think is, I think this is an important conversation, and particularly around language. But what I also found really interesting is that part of the sort of peppering maybe of the class consciousness came through music, right, for you, and through lyrics. And so there's always ways in, I guess, because from what I understand from reading your book, you live in a culture that doesn't value working class identity, and you essentially internalize the culture's values, which at that point essentially sort of neoliberal, bootstraps, it's all on you. But the music of working class artists is the thing that is sort of breaking through the sort of cultural noise. And again, like you said, like, you don't have the language for it at the time, you just feel it. And I think that's probably the ultimate truth, is that most people feel their way through things. For all intents and purposes, that's, how maybe you navigate life, or you get to these conclusions. Like, you had that feeling in school where it's just like, this is crap. And there's all kinds of things I do not like about this, but this music I'm listening to, and the lyrics and the energy is doing something that feels right, where all this other stuff feels wrong. So I think there's always space for this stuff to
seep in.
Yeah.
Punk rock was a way of doing that. And it's interesting because country and Western music is mainly right-wing populism. My life sucks, but I have you. And if I don't have you, I'll kill you. It's the basic messages. But there's also
I don't know that that's necessary. I mean, I grew up in the South, and I grew up listening to a lot of country music, so I wouldn't say
there are exceptions, but it's basically that the personal is your solution, not the political or the social or the economic, except for that song by Johnny Paycheck, "You Can Take Your Job and Shove It, I Don't Work Here Anymore," and a couple of others. But there's also a left music that came out more in the 60s and earlier with Woody Guthrie, who grew up through the communist tradition of the 30s, and then Bob Dylan. And now it's peppered throughout, which is very interesting in the music. And it was really present in punk rock.
Well, I mean, that's also true, I think, in the history of hip hop too.
Yes.
I mean, there's the commercial music is always like, a personalized, individualized, emotional kind of, thing, right? So I think what you're talking about more is like commercial country, commercial rock, commercial pop. I mean, you can apply that like individualized frame to any type of given music, right? I mean, even like, commercial punk, is heading, a little bit of, like Blink 182, I guess, that's not, is that even punk, or is that just like taking punk aesthetics, right?
Yeah.
But
it's taking the energy. It's certainly taking some of the energy, but it sort of drops the politics, I guess.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, that's always kind of, one of the major trajectories of music as it assimilates into right, the mainstream.
Right. Sorry, I was just going to say that one of the figures that I am spending a chapter on it, in this very long chapter, is Marky Smith from The Fall. And one of the things I was thinking about are musicians who insist on not being digestible. So he was just incredibly difficult. And, mentioning punk, I mean, the early punk, some of the punk musicians were also difficult. Many of them, of course, just wanted commercial success. But this kind of, I don't know, that's important to me. And then the other thing I was thinking about was the music that I mentioned listening to in high school. I mean, it wasn't necessarily, I guess Paul Weller in the Jam, and then later in the Style Council, they certainly did talk about, the miners' strikes, and they and the labor and Thatcher and things like that. But it isn't as if they, said, now let's go get some. Oh, maybe they did. I mean, they did talk about organizing, but I think for me, just even, I guess I'm just trying to point out that just even mentioning Thatcher or the miners or striking in a song, and it also has to do with context, right? Because it's not appropriation. It really, let me think about how to say this, right? I was also thinking about Mark Linkous and, his remaining in the South and resisting moving, to LA, or did move to New York and LA, but it almost killed him and he moved back. But living in the South and living in isolation, right? Not just doing his own kind of thing. And I don't know, there's just, it's almost like even just the smallest things. And I'm not quite sure how to articulate it, because it's not the thing that I guess I'm trying to also point out is what I'm thinking about or talking about is not a form of identity politics, because then that just goes back to what we're talking about before, right? That this is about being part of something much larger. It's a kind of anonymity. And I think that, when I was listening to the Jam when I was in high school, I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I wasn't alone, And there's something about that. And I think I have to think about it more, but it wasn't like what Paul Weller was talking about was, I would think, oh, that's Paul Weller. He's got these really cool ideas or whatever. I knew that he was talking about something larger that I belong to. And I think that's important. And it has to do with context, and it has to do with a kind of lack of distance between the singer, I guess, and what they're talking about, if that makes sense, right? Because whatever every I'm not going to talk about that, but it's not appropriation. It's a different kind of beast, I guess.
Yeah, I think one of the things I find really interesting is, as well as talking about this idea of there being a space for other things, like the key thing with the Jam or any of these bands is that they are creating art and music and cool stuff despite the system that they live in, right? So that they find something else. They find another way of being in the world. And, like you said, that can sometimes be expressed with an eating disorder, or it can be expressed with drugs. You can do it with music, but the point is you're finding another space. And I think you talked about the book Savage Messiah, and the whole documenting part of London as it sort of gets gentrified and sort of torn down, and that there's sort of a physical space that's being robbed of people as well, and that all that's left is people just being in their bedrooms. And to my mind, all of this stuff points towards video games, being on the internet, VR, like that. To my mind, is a sort of a political space that doesn't necessarily hasn't really been tapped for its political space. And I'm sort of riffing off what Alfie Baum said, but reading this reaffirmed that to me. Alfie Baum is a guest we've had on before, and he talks about sort of video game culture.
Mhm.
And and I sort of feel that is a space where if there are those things in there, like you said, that make you feel like you belong to something bigger than you, that becomes a way to help some people, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I would, and I'm glad you just said that because you helped me think a little more about this. I think that when I think about the GEM or the Style Council or Mark Linkus or I think in particular those people, they're chronicling, right? They're archiving what's happening, so they're making something that's different. You know, it's different than what you would see elsewhere, but then it still is within this world, right? So there's still Mark Linkus's songs are very sad, right? And there's a sense of mourning and melancholy within them. And he, of course, suffered from melancholia. So he's not making something that's not that. And that is a symptom of living in US culture, right? So it's reflective of the culture. He's not, if that makes any sense, he's not, and this is the difference between sort of cat power pre and after, is at a certain point, she just becomes a kind of slick product. And now when I hear her music, I really can't tell, is that Rihanna, is that lady? Like, I really have no idea anymore, but also there's no connection anymore to a world. And this is something I also wrote about in the book in terms of, you know, what I notice in contemporary American US poetry is it's as if it's not written in an actual reality. It's very odd. And I think this is part of it, right? So it's both a separate space, right? When I listen to Sparkle Force or something, I feel like, oh God, thank you, I'm in a different place. But it's not, it's still reflective of the horribleness of living in a culture like this, right?
Yes.
And I think for me, that's really important. And I know when I was listening to Cat Power, you know, during the early years when her albums were coming out, I would tell people, oh my God, I love her music so much. And they would say, but it's so depressing. And it was that thing. And I just learned the word for it and I forgot it. It was cathartic, right? So I would listen to it and feel better afterwards. And I think it was the thing of feeling like somebody was registering what I couldn't put words or music to. And then I could go on and live my life, right? And I just think, right, that's important to see that other people feel the same way that we do. And then you become this part of this larger thing, right?
It's an affirmation of your feelings and your reality, which a lot of the society denies. So it is really important.
You know, I mean, it's reading the book, like, it did remind me of a lot of my clients. And to a certain degree, I wish they could have, read the book because I think that, I mean, one of the major issues is with the working class in the United States. I mean, we call it the moving goalpost. Where you don't dictate the terms of how you describe your life. It's constantly dictated to, and even that dictation isn't really stable. It kind of shifts around to the convenience of everybody else, if that makes sense. That's kind of like the issue of, a stigmatized population in general, right? Is that you never get to say, hey, this is my life. This has been my experience. This is how I was impacted.
The narrative isn't yours, kind of thing. Someone else.
Right. Well, your story's always kind of filtered and co-opted, at the convenience of other people. So if you're kind of a good, good victim, right, then you get pedestaled. If you're not a good enough presentable victim, you're kind of shuffled away and told to shut the fuck up.
Right.
More or less, and you're never a whole person. You're kind of like a pastiche and a patchwork.
Right.
In the public imagination.
Yeah. No, exactly. And it just reminds me of this whole, sort of koan or this paradox that sort of started the book, which was, encountering enough having enough of these encounters where people would tell me, no, there is no social class in the United States. And then, whatever, the people I'm surrounded with would also say they never see working class people. And I was just shocked because literally you just look out the window, Brooklyn, Manhattan, any place. And, there's the post person, and then there's the bus driver, and then there's your nanny, and I mean everywhere, right?
Right.
And so
Every
that,
store you walk into.
I found that to be very shocking, but at the same time, there's this palpable sense of antagonism or real hatred, right? And I think you're sort of getting at a little bit of that, right? And so, how could that be? And I think what you're describing, right, matches up to that. It's that same kind of thing. This not existing and yet being told, you can't talk. It's just very right. It's a very strange situation, and that's what's social death is, right? Or symbolic death, I think.
Right. And when you do talk, right, it always gets turned around to like, I have a lot of criticisms about like, some of the common, features, I guess I should say, of 12-step in addiction, in substance issues. And one of the major ones that really, really get to me is oftentimes when people talk of abuse in the 12-step meetings and communities, it's not really uncommon for people to say, so what was your role in it?
Yeah. No, it's exact. I know. I'm so glad you're bringing this up because it's my thinking on the 12-step program is it's difficult because it saves lives. It does. And in that way, right, it goes back to what we were talking about before. If somebody's, in active addiction, so, and they can't even, it's debilitating, obviously, right? But at the same time, there is this blame, but there's also the whole system, at least in the cities that I've been in California and on the East Coast, they seem to be about aspiration, right? So,
right.
Which is problematic because, of course, it's not necessarily true, but also it suggests, it completely doesn't pay attention to the class part at all, right? So if you're working class poor, you're not going to get a house even if you have 20 years sober. Not necessarily, right?
It's again, you talk about the splitting, and a lot of the splitting is about people trying to navigate the complete utter incoherence that's thrown at them by society, right?
Yeah.
So one aspect of this 12-step, community and how it often forgets about class, because to a certain degree, I think it comes from somewhat, someone that was somewhat successful at certain times of life. Bill W. is the founder of 12 Steps, right? And I think coming from a white male in that era, right? The early 1900s, this language of accepting powerlessness might work, but it doesn't necessarily work. I had a lot of working class friends that, had drug use issues, some who didn't survive it. Go through the 12 steps and tell me, I do not need to be told I'm powerless. That is my life. That is my fucking life the minute I wake up to the minute I die. And a huge aspect, they didn't necessarily clarify it in exactly those words, but, listening to them over the years going through one rehab after the other is the huge issue isn't that because there's this huge culture, like you said, of aspiration, right? But at the same time, if you're a working class kid in these environments, your counselors will literally tell you accept any shit job. That is, accepting a shit job and living in poverty is important to you. And it's well, it's not important to me. That's not what I want out of my life. And at the end of the day, that's why I fucking do a shit ton of drugs.
Oh my gosh. I am so glad you said that because it really is. That's part of early recovery, right? Is getting an early recovery job. And so, trying to get sober or get off drugs and insist that actually perhaps you don't want a job. And we talked about this earlier. What if you just think the system's screwed? The program isn't really, generally speaking, it isn't really going to work for you, right?
One of the things to a certain degree that's kind of touching about working with a lot of people is how many people want a life that contributes not just to themselves, but to the community. right?
Yeah.
That like they want a life, that's not just good for themselves, but they want to bring something to the bigger world. And I actually do see a lot of that in the working class, you know. And one of the major aspects of that is like a lot of people feel like this is, a contribution to society is something that is actively denied of them, regardless of what they do.
Right.
Because like, one person that I talked to, and he was in his 20s, but like, one of his major things is like, yeah, like, people tell me like, get a job, go to school, you can do this. But, it's like my dad went back to school and he got a bachelor's degree and ended up costing the family, a lot of like, money and sacrifices. And it didn't get him a better job.
Right. Yeah.
That's one of the major things of like, because nowadays, now that like bachelor's has gotten so common, I mean, I've applied for like receptionist jobs where they're like, we require a bachelor's degree. So at this point, like having a bachelor's is kind of like having a high school graduation.
Yeah. I think the other piece that I was just thinking about Freud, civilization and its discontents, right? And the part in there where he talks about, one of the ways, that civilization, that society, and you could read it as capitalism, really is this sort of, this problem, right? And so what are the ways that people try to deal with it? And one is, he says, intoxication, right? Another one is withdrawal, escaping. And so, right, it's this, so if you're not, and this is what I'm interested in, right? If you're not if capitalism is killing you and your family and all your friends, right? Then, right. So then you go to a 12-step program and you're not, we see that the society is the problem. The program isn't going to work because the program is about fitting yourself into the society, becoming a productive part of society. And so that whole piece, right? And I mean, so it's really, for me, it's really interesting to think about, because it doesn't, you're right, getting a crappy job at the local, CVS or something is, I don't know, it's not going to, it's actually just going to make things worse.
Yes, that idea that there's dignity in labor, but actually a lot of the time it doesn't feel like that at all.
Right. Yeah, I mean, especially because you're not necessarily treated well. Yeah, I mean, it's one thing, like, if you were treated well at work, you had a lot of, you were able to develop like close relationships with other people at your work and have some kind of social connection there. But that's not really guaranteed in most modern workplaces.
Yeah, and then the other thing, it goes back to what you were just talking about, is that that so many of the jobs now, and so many of these jobs, it's just like working in a factory. So factory, there's not as much factory work, for example, in the US, but working at the register at CVS or Duane Reade for 10-hour shifts, 8 hours, or sorry, 5 days a week or whatever. I don't know. It's not that different. And, and not to mention that one can't survive working full time at one of those jobs.
Right.
I know people who have to have 2 or 3 of those jobs. And then, not only are you not surviving, but you're also not actually, like you were saying, feeling like you're contributing. I mean, I guess if you go to enough meetings, you might feel like you are, because, maybe you could be nice to people, but, it's hard.
Well, and I think, like, how comfortable you feel in those environments does kind of depend on how passive you are, whether you've taken like the passive route or the oppositional route.
Right.
Because those are like the two, options that you kind of have in the stigmatized population. Is like, are you going to like just be passive and kind of try to coast through, or are you going to be oppositional? And to a certain degree, that can be a harder path in terms of that's often the path that lands you in prison.
Right. No, exactly.
But it is also like, I mean, that's one of the major aspects of like, from a counselor and treatment end of, things like a lot of times, sometimes like the passive people are they may be easier to work with because they don't fight you. But they're often like really hard to kind of develop, because ultimately, what I consider a success isn't necessarily that has nothing to do with use, right?
Yeah.
It's that like you have something to live for.
Right.
And a lot of times it's actually the oppositional people that are actively trying to find something to live for. Like to a certain degree, like Wanda's character reminded me of a lot of people in that, kind of like the passive, but also like, I mean, the first step that she makes, right, of like leaving her husband and kids to find something. There is some spark there, regardless of whether like the outside viewers may find that to be, ethical or moral or responsible. But that comes from a certain level of spark that then she kind of like, falls into a certain passive pattern a little bit, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, this is why I'm so fascinated by this film and this other film I mentioned, Abschied von Gestern, because they're similar in a way. I mean, engaging in acts of theft or, Abschied von Gestern, she lies and she does have these affairs with middle class bourgeois men. But then one has to ask, I mean, she's lost her jobs and she can't get another one. And this is the thing I think about with Barbara Loden's character. So she latches on to these, creepy men. And, so lots of feminist women think, my God, why would you do something like that? And of course, what were her other options? And so it's
right.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I was also thinking about, I think more so with Abschied von Gestern or just in general that, it's to have this what you call spark or this this desire to live, right, is exactly what ends up appearing to others as you said, sort of opposition, right? This so these are the people that end up getting arrested. I see just on the street, somebody will be walking down the street and they don't quote unquote look right, and so they're stopped. So it just seems like it's I don't know. It's difficult, right? So you're either passive and then you're sort of a zombie, which Barbara Loden said, she was a zombie for many years.
Right.
Or you pick this other choice. I'm not going to let myself become this thing. But then, that life thing inside you and the rage, how does one utilize that language or that incoherent language?
I mean, to a certain degree, it's very coherent, right? It's just that nobody listen to it.
Oh my God. No, that's exactly it. It's almost a different language. One of the things I was really interested in recently is this screaming, right? Just the scream is this kind of language that's really, a person who's been pushed to the other edge, beyond the edge, of language, or of course, a riot, right? Or arson, these other acts that it is a form of language, like you just said, but it's a language that's not understood. It's not seen as coherent or.
Yeah, just reminds me as well, like in the book you were talking about how oftentimes the human body becomes the vehicle for all of this stuff that needs to sort of get out, like all the words not spoken, or you don't even have the language for it, but it's like inside your body and it needs to be released. You sort of use the libidinal language, which, as far as I understand it, if I was reading it right, the sort of libidinal energy is basically just that. It's just an energy and it has to go somewhere, right?
Yeah. And so, you think about, I was thinking about Amy Winehouse and No, my brain just crashed.
Well, we have done
Ian Curtis, sorry, right?
Yeah.
And you can see it, right? You can see it in their bodies. But then, that sort of cycles over, if you can't get it out some way, then there's alcohol, or there's, chain smoking, or other sorts of ways of tamping that down, so that you don't sort of do something, right?
Right. Or, I mean, sometimes, people drink so that they can get it out, right?
Yeah. No, you're right. Exactly. And that's why it's so complicated, right?
Right. But I mean, and it's, kind of like reading through your book. One of the things you talk about is kind of like this middle class confidence.
Yes.
Yeah.
That you talk about. But, but again, like, and you especially kind of see this in treatment spaces a lot. And I think it's really one that, people that go and work in these spaces should be a lot more cognizant of, is like in terms of like, how clients talk to you, what gets perceived as rude, right? is for the huge part, like the more successful, the lawyer that is, coming to, get treatment versus like, the homeless person, right? What gets seen as rude, in terms of a lot of times is absolutely not based on content necessarily. But the fact that, like, if certain people talk to you as an equal or treat you as an equal, right? It's like, oh, you're talking above your station, kind of. Do you know who you're talking to? You need to show deference.
Right.
And that those subtle kind of, interactions that people have over time of like, because there are certain people that, are allowed to talk to you as equals. And there are certain people where like, if they show a certain tone or if they show a certain casuality, right, that, it gets perceived as rude.
Right. And it's funny, it's a different context, but it reminds me of how, and I think this is in the book, when I was talking to my dad, when I was younger, and I asked, I wanted to sort of ask permission if I could apply for college, right? What did he think? And he told me, right, he said something like anyone can get an education, but it takes, or whatever he said, a person with great character to be able to, get an education and then be able to speak to everyone as if, be able to talk to everyone, right? You're the same person with everyone. And it's interesting because that is, from where I come from, that's a form of character. But then, right, what you're talking about, is it's actually considered not, right? You have to know your station. There's also a whole world of the way that you should hold your body in certain places. These are class-based, and if you don't know them, then you don't know them. But people will read your body language and the way that, right, everything you're saying as as being rude.
Yeah, or angry, or
Yeah. It's so interesting.
So that's a huge, what I mean, it's one of the things of like, in mental health of how like, a lot of people are just like, well, like, one, help is absolutely not accessible in the United States, but also just, when people kind of bristle against, getting treatment, people are just like, oh, like, again, like it gets kind of turned on the individual of like, oh, you're not ready, you're not this, not trying hard enough. But it is those kinds of attitudes that are inherent in these spaces that make it a really, really seriously unwelcome space for a lot of people. If you're trying to get help, the last thing people need is to be made to feel like they're inferior.
Right.
Yeah. But unfortunately, a lot of these spaces are imbued with a lot of these like classist notions that, people step in, they feel it because they've been subjected to it their entire life. So they're like, oh, this is like every other fucking place. Fuck you.
Yeah. I think what's really, I guess what we keep sort of bumping up against, which is something I'm very interested in, is, so the working class or the working poor person who goes into a meeting and then gets like an old timey sponsor, let's say, who says, it's all about humility. I mean, that's what that's about, right? So you have to call me at 5 a.m. every morning and and all this kind of stuff. And unless they have a sense of class consciousness, I think, they will just internalize this stuff, right? So they, for some reason, relapse. And then, after a few relapses, nobody will call them back. And it's like their own fault. I mean, sometimes people won't even let them, like they won't answer the calls after a certain number or something, right? So this way, so you either internalize that and it's I guess that's what I'm thinking. But that's that split we were talking about, right? That kind of madness, right? And this is the thing that I, again, see amongst people I know is, this without class consciousness, the split happens, and that can only lead to a kind of madness, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the particular quote, the upper class's sense of ease and effortlessness is perhaps one of the most powerful forms of capital. And I have definitely met people like that. I'm just, where has this confidence come from? You're like, oh yeah. Oh right, yeah, of course. Certain kind of schooling, certain kind of background. And then also what compounds that is that if you are working class background and you've internalized all these sort of neoliberal ideas about like who you should be and how you're not measuring up, and then that dents your confidence, and then you're carrying yourself in a certain way, and maybe you're being a bit more quiet than everyone else. Suddenly it's like worlds apart between you and the person in a higher class, as it were. And it just makes everything sort of twice as worse. Right.
Exactly.
I mean, even if you're like really quiet, if you kind of have a certain trapping, right, then you're like seen as like gentle, considerate, right? If you belong to a certain class, everything gets it's possible for things to always be seen in a positive light.
Right.
If you're from a working class, like you have this thing where like everything has the potential of being seen in a negative light, right? You're not confident, you're brash, you're rude.
Right.
Yeah. You're not shy, right? You don't have confidence, you have no self-esteem.
Right.
So
exactly. I remember I was talking earlier about how I hopefully am good at teaching and writing and getting these ideas down. I'm less good at the other stuff, and really have a hard time at these sort of social, academic sort of social things. And somebody had once told me, who was outside of this kind of system, who was from the middle class, who's, they said, oh, you should go and you should network, as if I would be networking with my colleagues. It doesn't make sense anyway, but this is the way that things are now, right, in the United States. And I said, basically, if I go to this thing, what I tend to do is I go up to someone and I just start talking about what's happening. So like what's happening in the Ukraine right now, I just go up and talk about whatever's happening. And I think I know now that that's not the way these things work, right? There's a certain sort of etiquette in a way that you talk, there's a certain kind of small talk thing. And I fail at that over and over. So if I were to go to this event that this person told me to go to, I would actually make things worse for myself, right? And this realization was a kind of freedom, because I realized, this assumption that if you go to these kind of events, you will be able to sort of network and do all this stuff, which, I think is sort of awful. It suggests that you're able to do these things, right? And where would you learn how to do these things, right? And in my family, at least, I mean, nobody knows how to do these things.
Right.
Not,
Right. Well, I mean, a lot of times, that I feel the unsaid thing about networking is that it is filtering for,
exactly.
For mostly it's filtering for a certain level of subordination, Because
Mhm,
networking, people, you are presenting yourself to people that will potentially hire you, right?
right.
It's not like a meeting of equals necessarily.
Right.
They're not looking for partners. It's a position where most people there are going to be, subordinates to.
Yeah.
So people are kind of like looking for things like, and to a certain degree, that's the big part of like, do you understand the culture?
Right. And so, going back to what you were saying earlier, if you don't understand the culture, then it's not, in fact, it will only be, an awful experience, but also it's
Right.
actually going to make things worse. It's actually best not to go.
Not to, right.
Not to go.
Because then like it's like people either don't know about you or they have a negative
Right.
impression of you, and it's better that like they not know much about you than a negative one, right?
Right.
I guess there's another conversation to be had at some point, which is sort of, I don't know, the middle class version of all of this, right? When say the middle class, they all go to the schools, they all know the etiquette, and then what is that existence like? The impression I get is it's full of status anxiety. There's plenty of middle class people that are they have the money and the resources, but they'll still spunk all their money up the wall on drugs and jump out of a window and stuff like that. So there's definitely something, even if you sort of ascend to that world of maybe having a bit more free time and more cash, there's still there's all kinds of hazards in that space as well.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, I think this thing about, we live in I think, capitalism is an insane system. And so all of us are, I mean, none of us are not affected. I just think we're affected in different ways,
Right. Well, and I think that's also one of the things about like, some people do see that like, assimilating isn't going to benefit me either. Right. Because they see all the hazards of, the status and the job anxiety. Right. Like, one of the things that like, I remember he was a cook. Right. He was just like, the one thing that's great about my job is that I can tell my job to, my boss to go fuck himself and get hired really quickly again somewhere.
Yeah. That's great.
Right. And he was like, that's, because he was talking about how like, I mean, he was a really, great conversationalist. I loved talking to him, really bright, just super witty. And like, he was, one day he was talking about how like, people were constantly telling him because, he's a witty, sharp, bright guy, like that, his career is below his station. Like, why didn't you aspire for more?
Wow.
And he was just like, like I've seen some of my friends who have succeeded, and like in professional jobs, telling your superiors to go eat a bag of dicks is the end of your career. In a way that it is not the end of the career in my, he's like, I choose this freedom.
Right.
Over that. And I remember having that conversation going, oh yeah, like that makes all the sense in the world,
Right.
But that's one of the, I mean, and for him, good for him that he really enjoyed what he did. He also enjoyed the kind of like, the environment of the kitchen and kind of how, kitchen staff works together a lot. You can build some pretty solid relationships.
Yeah, to I guess sort of tie a bunch of different things together, like something you said, Ikoi, about ultimately the people that you see, it's just navigating to a place where the person feels like it's worth being alive, that there's something worth doing. And the impression I get from reading this book, that to some degree that's the conclusion, that the dealing with melancholia and or the mourning that happens in the process of some kind of assimilation or just coping in the world is just that the the deal is like it's about finding a way to cope that allows you to keep going, that is in some way healthy and enriching for you. Does that track? Am I talking nonsense? Like, do you have sort of particular ways that you sort of address sort of that feeling of loss or mourning or melancholia?
I mean, I guess for me, the bottom line is class consciousness. So once I realized, oh, wait, right, the language and the concepts, once I realized, oh, wait, that's what this is, right? Then all of a sudden I'm able to create this space, right? So we're talking about all these, experiences and all these experiences. And I'm not alone anymore, right? I realized it's this structure that I'm a part of, right? And so for me, that's sort of the end result, right? And again, like I said, that's not like having class consciousness doesn't necessarily change the world, right? It doesn't mean that I have work lined up for next semester, because I don't, or health insurance or those kinds of things. But my God, it just makes such a difference, right, in my my experience of these things. And so that, I think, is because that's the thing is
I think
I
it's
guess that's the
grounding.
thing. Yeah, no, it's definitely grounding, right? And I think it just changes the way that I see things. And I think that's important. And one of the things I was thinking about, in and out of this conversation is just that voice that's in our head, right? And that voice in my head, so much of that voice for so many years, and I mean, believe me, it's still there. But it was just this voice that said, you're shit, like you are worthless and you are stupid. And, it's this endless sort of repetitive thinking. And it's not that I don't have that. I certainly still have that. I don't know how one gets rid of that. But I do have this other larger thought, which has to do with this sort of structure, which is that voice came from this thing, and then I can get mad about that thing, right? And so that makes all the difference.
Right. I mean, that's one of I think, the major weaknesses in like CBT. And the whole thing of like, changing your self-talk is again, like, it's really hard to do, I think, without understanding, larger systems, which is what class essentially is understanding how, society is structured. Because otherwise, I think, sorry to interrupt, but because one of the things about like not understanding, I think, class consciousness to a certain degree is in what it does to people is it gives people this free flowing anxiety that they can't anchor themselves to anything because they're told everything wrong is about themselves.
Right.
If that makes sense.
And then also, I mean, it's also obviously, in terms of, making or doing something that seems to matter. Not to say that my writing up until this last book doesn't matter. I mean, it matters. And, I know that it's affected people, but I think this work, you said grounded. I mean, it's just rooted in something that it feels much bigger, and it feels like it's speaking to something much larger. And so just it's also that. So regardless of if I have work or an income or health insurance or any of that stuff, these two things, right? Really realizing that so much of this had to do with class, and then being able to look back and sort of see my life and all of these experiences in a different light. And then also being able now to write more about this. And, this is what I'm thinking about now and writing about.
Yeah. And I think that your writing, it's just a very, it's very readable whilst at the same time being like full of kind of, you said you've written a lot of poetry, but there is this sort of very kind of visual quality and sort of feeling quality to your whole book. And it doesn't have any of that sort of academic nonsense where you read a couple of pages or paragraphs or like a sentence, you're like, what the hell was that about? I don't understand. And, and
Right.
when you review said academic material, you realize they're saying something very simple, but they have to dress it up because, that's what their job depends on. And so like for me, reading this was, just it. I wouldn't say easy because you're going through a lot of stuff, but it was, I felt a lot of things, and I think that's the best thing ever. I think it's a great book, and I think to my mind, that's winning. If you are sort of living and working in the academic space, and you can write things that regular people can sort of understand and feel, then that's awesome. And the only other thing I'd add is just that I think what's sort of telling about the critical voice, which I guess in Freudian terms would be the superego, right? Like that's the sort of internal policeman or parent or teacher that we all have in our head. What's telling about that voice is it never has a sense of humor. Like if you actually think about like, so we spoke to, was it Tracy Higgins a couple of episodes ago? She had paranoid schizophrenia. Like none of those visions are positive, right? Like all the things that sort of were haunting her, they're all negative, and for it's for grounded, solid reasons, right? A lot of trauma, but the point being that the negative voice, the sort of ghosts, all of that stuff, like they never. If you think about ghosts in stories, they very rarely have a sense of humor. They're always sort of coming to do something nasty, and so there's something very telling about. That sort of self-talk, or the things that you're scared of, that there's nothing funny in it. And I think that to my mind, comedy and jokes and all that stuff just kind of completely neutralizes that sort of authoritarian person inside all of our heads. Because, and that's why dictators can't stand to be laughed at
Made
as well.
fun of.
Yeah. No, that's so great. I love that. Hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, it's that's why we laugh, I think, and why it's fun and why it's enjoyable, because it gives you a break from yourself.
Right. And I think, that's a huge part of why comedy can be really difficult. I think it's a very difficult art as far as, actually being a good comedian. But reading this book from, doing what I do, like you touch up on a lot of issues that are inherent in a lot of substance use in our society. And I think and also just this would be just a really good book. I think that like a lot of people wanting any kind of mental health interventions would be good, right? Because one thing is, I was like kind of reading through the book is also like how mental health is presented in society, right? Is that like, the non-stigmatized mental health, is the middle class version of middle class presentation, whether it's depression or anxiety or anything else, right? It's the middle class presentation that is, non-stigmatized. And it's the working class presentation that is like stigmatized and called severe oftentimes.
Right. And we do eventually have to end, but the conflation, right, of poverty and crime and mental illness, right? This is an old kind of trope, right? And I think people even get confused about. I think there's an inherent sense, that it's all the same, right? So the homeless person, right, is a criminal, is insane, and also, have always been poor, right? Just this idea.
Yeah. Yeah, no, but it's also just, like this kind of this, like a lot of times, the mental health is kind of like just an inner issue that doesn't bleed outside.
Right, exactly, of course. Right.
because they're just like, oh, like, if you're depressed, it's if your depression bleeds out into you can't work, you're no longer able to like maintain healthy relationships with other people. Right. That's kind of like, when it starts to become, we don't really want to talk about that.
Right.
But as long as it's just about like how you feel about yourself and how you talk to yourself, right? We're going to destigmatize those parts.
Right. No, exactly.
And a lot of times I think, when it comes to like mental health issues within the working class, there is a lot, because that's also like the cultural differences. One of like the major cultural differences that, I've noticed a lot of times is around conflict.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times middle class is about like finding the right time and the right space, which often means like shut the fuck up. Right, don't mention it again. Like, it's a nice way of saying that, right? The right time and the right place versus a lot of times a lot of working class people are like, if we have conflict, let's get it over with now.
Right. Yeah.
That's a very cultural thing, so a lot of times, I think the natural end result of like any kind of like, because mental health is about conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, right? It's like whether it's conflict within yourself or with the rest of the world, there's a huge element of conflict there, and like they tend to be a lot more expressive about there is this conflict that I need to deal with. They mean, and it may not necessarily be straightforward that way in a conscious way, but, it tends to come out a lot more in that way and out externally rather than internally.
Right. Exactly.
I suspect we should probably wrap
things up.
I do. That it was awesome to speak to you, and thank you very much for writing the book, because it's brilliant, and I feel like it's one of those ones that I'm going to return to a lot.
Absolutely.
Thank you for inviting me. Really, we could keep going on, but it doesn't make any kind of sense.
Right.
Well, it's interesting. So Ikoi had sent me, was it yesterday or the day before, was it the LA book review?
Yeah.
And maybe I'm misunderstanding sort of how there was the lady said, you identify as working class. Now, to my mind, that made it sound like it was a choice. Now, maybe I'm misunderstanding what identity is. Like people identify their pronouns or their gender, and they have like hopefully the free choice to say that. And but it's not. They would say it's not a choice. This is who I am. So maybe someone saying, "Oh, you identify as working class," is completely fine as a statement, but it did throw my brain when the interviewer said it, because I was like, it makes it sound like it's a choice.
Oh, I think that's yeah. No, I'm so glad you said that. I think that's the difference between the United Kingdom and the United States. So it's such a great great that you noticed that, because it implies, right, that it is a choice. It actually implies that it's a kind of identity, right? Identity politics,
right?
A kind of
that's
thing,
it.
Right?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And that it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because I didn't even, it's always weird when people ask that question. I don't really know.
Yeah.
I answer it differently. I answered it differently when somebody asked me recently, but there is this thing like I get to choose, right? And I think that goes to show you this very thing that I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, it's being Japanese in the United States, I get asked like, so you identify as Japanese or American? And I've gotten to the point where I started saying, actually, I identify as Japanese to fuck with people. I do, but also just to fuck with people, because, they ask that question because they're expecting a certain answer. Right. That's the thing. That's the thing about a lot of those questions, is that they're not a question of honestly asking.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Like they're not interested in the answer. They ask that because they feel they know the answer.
Right.
You
But
know, and so
what
when
I
you
don't
say
understand
like,
what the opposite is. Like, what could you choose if you like? I identify as middle class, but like I don't get it. Like I'm not. You know, it's sort of like a big topic maybe, and it maybe involves touching on loads of subjects. But I didn't understand fully that like it could be a choice that you could say something in between. You know, you know, but I identify as it. It's like you are it. And maybe I'm misunderstanding what identify means. Maybe identify does mean I am this. But it also, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
I
no,
think a lot of those questions. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's just really great, the question, because it touches on all of these seemingly invisible structures, right? So the other thing is that, so I think a lot in the United States, the idea of working class, it's just related to your economy. So people get very confused when they find out, for example, that a nurse makes, I mean, I don't know, you know, certain professions in the working class, right? They make us, so people think that, you know, if you're, right, you're working class if you have this job, right? And then you choose, so it's very much based on money, right? And economy, and that's not, right, I'm not thinking about money and economy, I'm thinking about structure, right? I'm thinking of structural ideas here, and the way that, you know, it doesn't matter actually how much I mean, I don't obviously, but it doesn't matter how much money I make or what I look like, I still can't seem to get a full-time teaching job in this country. And I've been trying for many, many years, you know, or some of these other things, right? So that doesn't have anything to do with these things, right? But that question, I think, suggests both that one has a choice, right? And also that one can assimilate, right? That one can decide, okay, I'm going to be middle class and therefore I am middle class. Right. So it's, I'm so glad you brought up that question because it illuminates this very.
Yeah, I just didn't want, in some ways I thought about opening the podcast on it, but at the same time I also didn't want to dunk on that person who asked the question. I was like, yeah, maybe I'll ask at the end and then I can always cut it out. But I think to my mind, it just, like you said, it's sort of like lifting up a rock and seeing all the insects underneath. Like, what does that even mean? Yeah, exactly. It's like, this idea that, you know, maybe in a couple of years, be like, yes, well, actually, I identify as stinkingly rich upper class now. When you return to the LA book review, you can be like, yes, well, I wear a monocle and a top hat.
Monocle.
Well, I mean, to a certain degree, a lot of those questions are fundamentally lies in where does your allegiance lie?
Right.
No, that's exactly on another level, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, that is kind of like, you know, are you one of us or are you one of them?
Yeah.
You know, it is. And oftentimes, again, like these aren't malicious, conscious things that people are thinking when they ask you these things. It's just that these concepts are so imbued in society that, you know, it just comes out.
Yes, that's a good point. It could well have been asked out of a sense of responsibility or etiquette, but in doing so revealed sort of something else.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Right.
You know,
it's super fascinating.
Yeah.
Which side are you on, right? Like that's considered kind of a rude question too, you know. But but oftentimes that's one of the big things about like social interaction when in a class society is that you know there's this constant like, are you one of us? Are you one of us? Are you one of them?
Right.
You know
right.
You know. That's kind of like a whole what networking is. Are you one of us, right? You know, so if you don't want to play the us game, you know, it's really not a beneficial environment.
I mean, right. I know we need to
I was
going to say, you know, so I did open the book with this encounter with somebody who, you know, was a former professor of mine who I had met for coffee, who I don't think was trying to be malicious. And I think this is the thing, who said, well, you don't look working class. And it was just still to this moment, but especially at that time, it's just these kind of whiplash things where in the moment, the moment is traumatic, right? I'm in the moment, but I'm not there anymore. And then I have to sort of tend to it later, right? In the moment, I didn't have the wherewithal to say, wait, excuse me, right? I just kind of drank my coffee and whatever, I think. But that that's another one of these sort of Bermuda Triangle questions. Like, what do you mean? What do the working class? It's just crazy. So what does a nurse wear that's different than what you're wearing, or whatever? A school teacher, or whatever. Like, it's just so completely maddening. But the question wasn't, you shouldn't have a knife to my neck. She wasn't, I don't think, trying to be mean and that's part of the problem, right? Is that all of this invisible stuff it works through all of these encounters. And people, when you earlier were talking about, how do the middle class encounter, experience things? And I think all of this stuff is invisible for them, right? And so that's the thing, right? So I don't think the woman asking me the question was being malicious, or this former professor was being malicious, but it's, but that question was super interesting because she assumed I was on her side, right? Going back to this thing, right? She assumed that I was with her and not with those other people who don't look like me, right?
Yeah. And
not that that's true, but you know what I mean.
Right. And I think that's one of the fact that it's not necessarily malicious, right? And the fact that it's not, necessarily made in ill intent is also often what makes it so hard to counteract.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
Because if you do counteract it, then that's where, you're rude. You're so rude, because that's where that comes in, versus when somebody's being directly hey, are you one of us? Or are you one of them? You can't counteract that with fuck you.
But it's fuck yourself. What's the quote? It's be kind with people and ruthless with systems.
Yeah, this is Michael Brooks.
Right, yeah.
So yeah, that's one of the aspects of politeness that can be really difficult to navigate politely,
Right. The other thing, and I think this is, one of the haunting things is, if one were to actually respond appropriately to a question like that, appropriately meaning sort of at the volume at which the question was pitched, I guess, one would appear mad. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Or what,
right.
in a very small sort of boutique coffee shop, if I lost my shit,
right.
It would just, right?
It'd be funny though.
But I think maybe, right? Or maybe I'd be arrested. I guess I wouldn't, but I think there is, and it goes to what we were talking about before about the people who are passive and the people who aren't. There's always, for me, this fear that I'm going to appear insane because having to sort of push that rage and these, these realizations, right? You see this stuff all the time. You have these encounters all the time that you can't say anything. If you say something, you get in trouble, but then, you have to repress it. And where does that go? Right. So in that moment, I didn't say, I said something like, whatever I said, it wasn't related to it, but I really wanted to start screaming.
Yeah.
Right. But obviously screaming would result in something bad.
You always think of the 10 awesome responses in the shower, that evening.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's just you don't look like an idiot, but you clearly are.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.